I'm going to invite Martha first to come to present her paper, Bridging the Gap Between Yoga Scholarship and Practice, Explorations in Democratizing Knowledge. Welcome, Martha.
Thank you. It's great to be here and to see so many people participating as well, and particularly because, as you'll see, this is quite preliminary research. It's some early thinking. It's much about raising questions. So I'm really hoping that there'll be some good reflections in the discussion, because I'm as much interested in hearing from other people as well as we start to sort of flag some of these issues and encourage discussion around it. So I'm just going to share my screen. There we go. Hopefully someone will tell me if you can't see that. As you'll see, this is a joint paper, actually, or joint piece of research between myself and Ruth McNeil. Ruth unfortunately couldn't be here today, so she was going to actually present a section of this separately, and we've slightly rejigged it. So I'm presenting for both of us. This has been a shared piece of research that we've kind of working on. We've actually just sent a paper off together, but this is also kind of my take on it too. So please don't blame Ruth if you like massively disagree with this. This is kind of like my perspective on some of what we've been working on together. So as it says, this is our take on bridging the gap between yoga scholarship and practice, our explorations in trying to democratize the knowledge that we gained through our academic study in this area. So just to give you a kind of an overview of where I'm going with this, I'm going to present some of the sort of early stage research insight that we've gained from doing interviews in this area. I'm going to flag something that we've called the destabilisation effect and talk a little bit about what that is and why that might be found in this particular field, sharing our own case studies to sort of support and like illustrate this, and then to start a kind of discussion around what this means for scholarship and practice, what it means for sort of both like navigating this space, and also what opportunities there might be here for co-production of knowledge. And I think it's sort of particularly this discourse around the scholar practitioner and what we've got now in there, and whether this is sort of expanding that and what that might mean, and just sharing some further inquiries that we've been thinking of and would be really interested in hearing where you think we should take this, or where you might be interested in taking it. So in terms of our background, we both met, in fact, on the SOAS MA in Traditions of Yoga and Meditation. We graduated in 2020, so it's actually 5 years ago now. And we came to it from similar backgrounds in one respect, in that we'd both taken yoga teacher trainings, both kind of like quite classic, I guess, in the modern world, particularly the modern Western world, yoga teacher training. But the difference between us was that Ruth had been teaching yoga for quite a long time and was still teaching throughout and is still now. And I'd come fairly fresh off a yoga teacher training and had only done a little bit of teaching beforehand. So for those who are not familiar with the SOAS MA, it's situated in the Department of History, Religions and Philosophy at SOAS, which might give you a sort of a sense of its context. And it certainly at that point was a largely textual history of yoga and meditation in South Asia. That it has changed personnel and syllabus to a certain extent since then, so this, some of this may be more or less relevant, but at that point that was the focus of it. It was mostly historical, though it also kind of took a historical perspective on contemporary modern yoga. There was lots of discussion and there was some element of ethnography in it, and one of the sort of, I guess, the most revelatory and interesting bits of it, I think, for both of us, was looking at various critical theories and frameworks and applying that to our understanding of yoga. So it was quite broad in that sense, but it wasn't, for example, there was no physical practice, and there was no, it was sort of limited in terms of discussion around the philosophy of it and the ideas themselves. So we got to the end of our MA and we felt like incredibly lucky to have had that opportunity, and really conscious of the information that we'd gained on that not having been available to us beforehand. I suddenly became aware of all this wealth of knowledge that hadn't been there on our yoga teacher training, and we felt that there's an opportunity to share this, and we felt that had we been in that position before, and we want to know about this, but we didn't feel that we wanted to share that in, and this is no criticism of those who do, but we didn't want to share that in a particularly didactic way. We wanted that to be something where it was more of a sort of responsive, like live and responsive way. So, and that's partly, I think, possibly, as you'll see, this is a very personal reflection on this. We were still working through some of this stuff ourselves. So I guess part of it is us sharing knowledge in a way that sort of helps us process what we've learned. And I should say throughout, these are our personal reflections. We have some research insight, but I will make some generalizations. And I think there are legitimate generalizations to be made about teacher trainings and so on that kind of follow standard syllabuses and so on. But you may well have had a different experience, and that's fine. I'm interested in that too. And it may be that this is niche. Maybe this isn't the experience of everybody, but it is borne out by the research that we did. But yeah, we may find that later we get into stuff that kind of challenges what we've found here. So like, I don't want to negate an experience that you've had, or say this is everybody's, but this is the kind of our reflection on that. So when we left SOAS and we started having these questions, we decided that we wanted to perhaps hold workshops, perhaps teach on teacher trainings, like some way of kind of spreading this knowledge or sharing it. And we decided to do it like essentially a bit of market research. So this is research taken outside of an academic context. It was fairly informal, but we did, I'm also a user researcher in my day job. Like, I tend to come up with a research framework and quite carefully map that to the way that I'm asking the questions. So we came up with a set of research questions. We wanted to really understand like what we were trying to get out of it. And what we were focused on was like, how should we share this knowledge? What are the challenges going to be around that? And then feeling like something of a responsibility towards potential participants, like what could the effect of that be? Like what might that change about yoga practice and teaching? And the reason we're asking that is because we've already found that to be the case for ourselves at this point. And I'll talk about that in a second. And we were also interested, like, does this feed back into yoga scholarship? We just kind of wanted to continue our studies, and is this going to be relevant in some way? So we conducted 14 interviews in total, 7 with other students who'd been on the SOAS MA with us, and 7 with yoga teachers, all very experienced yoga teachers who'd taken at least like sort of 500 hours teacher training, been teaching for quite a while, and often sort of extended that through other CPD and so on. And also, as I said, this is personal reflection. The academic speak, this is our autoethnographies. So we have our own case studies in this. And we also spend a lot of time on the MA discussing with peers as well. And this is kind of bringing some of that in as well. Ruth in particular has gone on to do a lot more teaching yoga and running yoga events, and sort of bringing that to bear on that too. So she conducted interviews with yoga teachers, and we found some really interesting things here. So I think some of which challenges some assumptions we've seen within academia, that there's both a real appetite for yoga scholarship. So you're all here, so perhaps you're not the target audience, in terms of the people that we interviewed who weren't finding out about stuff like this. But certainly there is, at that point, there were lots of people who were completely unaware that there was this yoga scholarship, and in our interviews didn't seem that interested in it, perhaps because they weren't aware. But we have quotes, for example, from Horton and Harvey that said that there is a hunger in the yoga community for writing about yoga that is critical, challenging, political, and relevant to life in the 21st century. But that wasn't what we found with our interviewees. They were aware of issues, sort of critical issues that we looked at, from cultural appropriation, abuse, and so on. And they were aware that they were kind of happening in the yoga community, but didn't see themselves as being part of that, or necessarily that being that relevant to them. And strikingly, considering the way that we felt at the end of the MA, which is it almost had given us more of a sense of what we didn't know than what we did, is that 2/3 of those teachers that we interviewed felt they had no gaps in their knowledge that they couldn't find answers to, that they had a great deal of certainty about what they'd been taught. When we interviewed MA graduates, we found that as a cohort, they were mostly yoga teachers and committed practitioners, and that was true of the wider MA. There was a really high proportion of people from that background, from similar backgrounds to us, or perhaps different traditions and lineages, but similarly. Many had taken the MA because they wanted deeper knowledge, but some were also taking it because they were questioning their previous teachings. And that's certainly my case. I took the MA because I felt from my yoga teacher training I couldn't square some of the information I'd been given. The history seemed contradictory. The sort of focus on asana when we look at something like the Patanjali Yoga Sutra, and it doesn't really talk about that. I couldn't square that with what I'd been taught, and I hoped the MA was going to answer some of these questions. There's also the sense within this group that they are sort of, this is part of the practice, that taking the MA is perhaps, in sort of Foucault's term, a technology of the self in itself, is that they're sort of using the MA in order to explore these sort of more nebulous questions about like what it is to be human, in one person's quote, but also their own psychology perhaps. And most of them is expected that, even though it, you know, to be fair, it is advertised mostly as a history degree, essentially is like studying things from a historical perspective, had expected there to be opportunities to discuss the ideas and philosophies within it. In terms of the effect on them of going through the MA, there was things that you might expect about doing any kind of higher education, is that they felt that they'd become more critical and more selective, that they become better researchers. Some felt like sick of academic elitism. There was a sense that there was sort of perhaps like a snobbery towards yoga practice and teaching within academia. Again, like, I'm not saying this is everyone's experience or this is all academia, but that was certainly something that came through, and they were sort of rejecting it in some senses. But for most people, there was this sort of like these last few are categorized almost like there's this sort of a struggle to hold on to what you'd believed about yoga or what you'd felt about it beforehand. It perhaps lost its mystery, and that can be part of the power of a practice like this in some ways. A struggle to integrate the knowledge with practice. I felt that, and I know Ruth did too. And for a lot of people, they ended up abandoning previous teachings altogether. But that, interestingly, some people felt that was quite freeing, quite liberating, to sort of not be limited by what they've been taught, to kind of bring their self to it, their own interpretation of history, other kind of things from traditions that hadn't been part of their initial teacher training. And to sort of summarize this, I think this quote from my panel colleague Theo sort of illustrates it. Sort of why do so many MA graduates stop teaching yoga? The central contradiction here is like, once you start to accept that maybe sun salutations are not 10,000 years old, how do you test the claims of everything else you've been told in your yoga teacher training? So this is Ruth's case study. So I will just very briefly say that, like, her experience was very, very similar to what we're describing here. So it, you know, the findings sort of really resonated in her sense. It was, she did a yoga teacher training within the Deska lineage. The Yoga Sutra was a core text, and she'd been using that as part of her own teaching. Took the MA to kind of deepen her own understanding, and found that the critical emphasis, even just the practice of being critical of the history and taking these different approaches to it, was at odds with the previous teaching that she'd had, and that, you know, the kind of the certainty of it, and this idea that the MA brings in different views, this plurality, was central to her feeling of like personal destabilization, which we'll come back to. But she was a yoga teacher, so she had, you know, more incentive perhaps than most to kind of really work to reconcile this, and had that liberatory sense of like, okay, well, actually, I can kind of, you know, bring my own interpretation to this now. I can bring in other traditions, other texts and practices. And in particular, and she's now doing a PhD that kind of integrates some of this stuff as well, is seeing this as an embodied space between theory and practice, and like what that means, and really exploring that. So we've called this the destabilization, this sense that you're being very challenged in both the facts that you've been taught, the narrative that you've been taught, and also like the kind of the actual practice of being critical, and the idea that there perhaps isn't like a one true yoga. Like, I really came into the MA expecting to have like the truth of yoga revealed to me, and realized that actually it's much more messy than that, but also much more interesting than that, in many ways. Now, this is, you know, perhaps true of like other courses. There are you know, people who come from practice backgrounds on things like Buddhist studies or other kind of religious studies courses. It may well be in other cases. So, you know, we're a little bit tunnel vision on this. We're looking at it from our own perspective, and actually part of our further inquiries might well be broadening this out and seeing where we can see parallels. But I think there is something particular about the fact that on the MA, so many people had come from this same background of doing this sort of classic current TTC in a, for example, mine was called Ashtanga Vinyasa, It was Yoga Alliance aligned in terms of the syllabus, and that's really common now. You know, the way that those really emphasize authenticity, lineage and consistency, but also certainty, and the MA kind of exploded all of that with this idea that there's all these sort of plurality of views. It introduces lots of unanswered questions that you then have to kind of grapple with yourself. And all this meant that I think as the students and then graduates had brought quite a lot of assumptions to the MA that were sort of challenged throughout. And as I said, like, we don't claim this as a universal experience, and you know, it's 5 years ago since we've done this, so maybe things are changing, and the fact that so many people are now teaching on TTCs from that background, hopefully these things are getting integrated a bit better. But yeah, it is resonating for us. And when we presented this before, we've had other people say like this, yes, this was my experience too. So there's something going on here. And if nothing else, I think what we're doing in this research is sort of waving a little flag and sort of pointing it and going like, there's something happening here, and we think it's interesting to, and perhaps quite important to recognize that. Because one of the things is that there is no formal space to work this through. There wasn't in the teacher trainings that we did, and there wasn't in academia. And we ended up becoming very informal about that. We'd spent hours and hours talking about it in other spaces. And for us, it became like central to our ongoing inquiries, and as a motivator actually for our knowledge sharing. But we wanted to do that in a way that sort of embraced that. So we're not saying that academia has to necessarily embrace this. I think it's interesting, and it could potentially, but we weren't doing it from within that context. We were like, well, how do we take out of that, and how do we work in a way that still recognizes everything that we value about this practice and these philosophies and these ideas, but that still that works with this uncertainty and plurality that we're experiencing and we see in the history of it. And so one of the ways that I tried to do this is by starting up a book club. I know that sounds very simple, and it is a very simple idea. I took the Yoga Sutra because it's a text that I find really fascinating, that really resonated with me in lots of ways when I did my yoga teacher training, but also I was very confused by, as I said, you know, it doesn't really focus on asana, but so much of the rest of the course did. We're also, you know, we didn't get a chance to look at it in detail, but we are told on the course that I did, and I know that people have, like, well, you study this and you study Bhagavad Gita and you study the Hatha Yoga Pradipika, and these are all yoga, it's all the same yoga. And I was like, it doesn't look like the same yoga to it. It just seems like it's saying, at least like there's different things going on here, and perhaps even contradictory things. So I found it really fascinating and wanted to explore this with a group, and ended up like just working with local yoga practitioners and actually mostly yoga teachers in the area where I live. And it kind of started as a workshop and has expanded into a book club. And it's actually like trying to do this process, trying to kind of hold this space in between academia and scholarship has been really, really fascinating. Like, it sort of validated some of our early research findings that these people who you could characterize quite a lot of them as sort of village hall yoga teachers, were really unaware that there was all this scholarship out there. I didn't know about it, didn't know how to access it, but we're really keen to, like, we're really excited to finally have a chance to talk to other yoga teachers and to get into this stuff together. They were like me initially, sort of looking for that truth of yoga. So I felt, as the sort of facilitator of that space, quite a lot of responsibility to, I don't know, like, I'm still kind of wrestling with that a bit, but like, is it my job to upend that? Is it like, how do I work with the fact that some of what we're going to look at does challenge what they've previously been taught, and perhaps what they've been teaching themselves? But again, they were like the MA graduates, like, look, it was very personal. Like, there was a lot of sense that people were looking for personal relevance and revelation through this process. So you're dealing with stuff that's quite personal to people, and even though it might be an academic space, this was less academic, but within the academic context, I think it's sort of at least worth recognizing that you're working with people who've come to this as something that is like quite meaningful to them in some ways. It's quite integrated into their identity, their beliefs, and so on. And perhaps there's some responsibility there. But also, people found it quite freeing. It's like they'd had the same confusion that I had, and like learning that actually the history is quite entangled and messy was suddenly like, oh, okay, so I can I'm kind of freer to interpret that in my own way. And it's not just me being stupid, is that there is actually some contradiction here. But it was still quite challenging for people. Like one teacher since said to me, like, I've decided I can't say I'm teaching yoga anymore based on the discussions that we've had just going through this text. I don't know what I meant to do with that. I mean, is that something that I should recognize or be responsible for? Is that good? Is that bad? I don't know. Let's discuss. But one thing that is quite interesting is that they keep bringing up questions I wouldn't have thought of. And I'm now following research leads that have come out of people going like, well, what's that mean? And why is this? And bringing their own personal things to it. And it's just fascinating. Like it's becoming just a joy for me to do these sessions for all those reasons. And that's why I think there's a lot of scope here for this sort of space between academia and practice and teaching to be really fruitful in lots of ways. So, I think first there's like, I think we should recognize that that's what we're navigating here. That it's perhaps this destabilization is perhaps unusual in this subject matter, that is related to power. Like I feel quite conscious of that within my little book club, is that both, this is how we're used to being taught, is like the knowledge holder has the power and you're there to sort of sit and learn. And we're trying to sort of push at that, but people are still coming with those expectations. And I can say till I'm blue in the face that that's not how I want it to be. And people will still kind of bring their assumptions to that. So it's sort of being aware that when you present your opinion on something, that people might be taking that as what they should be thinking too. So, I think there's a lot of interesting questions around power. And as I said, questions around like what responsibility do the academy, do other people sharing this knowledge have for this potential destabilization? But it's also, as I said, like I think really fruitful potentially. Like there's this co-production of knowledge that we're experiencing, and Ruth too has been bringing this into sort of the workshops and so on that she teaches, and they're sort of allowing practitioners to be in dialogue with what we're finding in the scholarship is really interesting. We think there's a lot of value in this embodied experience and potential interpretation within that. And that's, it's producing both new understandings and new research for us. As Ellen and Paul say, co-production can bring air into a closed system, and perhaps all of us can at some point recognize the description of academia as a closed and sometimes airless system that could potentially, that bringing something else into it could actually be really exciting and interesting. And also there's sort of questions that we're now wrestling with quite a lot around, like, well, what does this mean for scholar practitioner? Because actually, I've been very focused on our MA, but there are other MAs. There are lots of online courses. Actually, the opportunities to access academic scholarship and knowledge and sort of research findings is like increasing now. And does that mean that this potential destabilization is increasing? And what does that mean? But also, the scholar practitioner discourse has been very focused around, or I think, the sort of the scholar as the person sort of in the academy, the published researchers and their sort of alter life as practitioners. It's like, what's the legitimacy here? What's the sort of questions of reflexivity and all that kind of thing? But actually, I think there's a lot more interesting stuff going on within scholar practitioner that we could expand to include students of these courses. So maybe it's not a binary between scholar and practitioner. And what happens if we kind of expand that out? Perhaps there's something interesting about just talking about that more and being more self-critical as yoga studies as a sort of a whole thing, and a bit more reflexive. I mean, there's a sort of danger in being too navel gazing, but I think there's actually something really interesting here, and acknowledging the sort of the value of embodied experiences. Like, what does that all mean? What effect would this have on scholarship? So I think we're kind of, like I say, we've been head down looking at this kind of stuff, and now it's time for us to expand this all out and see what other things might be relevant. So really keen to hear what other people's thoughts are, where we could take this. There's lots of other aspects of destabilization that we haven't really got into, sort of the cultural appropriation and identity and what might that affect, and we've kind of like been looking at that to an extent in previous discussions today. What other relevant pedagogical frameworks might there be for democratizing knowledge that we could apply to this? We've started to look at some of that, but haven't, I think there could be more out from other other sectors that we could look at, and just further explorations of the space. Like how do we do it? How do you do it in a way that works? Like, what's the effect? What could we learn from it? What could we do that sort of works with our own need to process this journey, and also is sort of value to the people we're sharing it to? So we're not insisting that there should be a relationship with academia and yoga practice, that every academic exploration that comes under yoga studies has to deal with this, but we're saying it already exists. So let's talk about it. Let's see what that means. And that this connection is both an opportunity and a challenge, and that's both in terms of the pedagogy of it, the teaching of it, and also, you know, the sort of the care of the students that are taking these courses. And perhaps leave you with one thought, which is the sort of advocating for this space in between, to say that if research hasn't changed you as a person, then you haven't done it correctly. Thank you very much.